discipline. It looks like someone on your team has you beat.
He apologized. I accept his apology.
I accept his apology.
He supports women.
He cares about women.
He's kind. He's a gentleman.
He's kind. He's a gentleman.
And they wrote lies. And I will not allow that.
But I will not allow people saying lies about me. It's damaging and it's unfair. It's damaging and it's unfair.
We are here in Sin City, USA, on the campus of the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. In a little more than 24 hours, in the Thomas and Mack Center, right behind us, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump will partake in their third and final presidential debate. Consistent with the spirit of a town that's famously played host to David Copperfield, Doug Henning, Siegfried Roy, and Penn and Teller, one thing to expect from the Republican nominee tomorrow night is plenty of that classic old misdirection. Plenty of attempts to make his many problems, poof, disappear. As Donald Trump continues to rail about a rigged election, more Republican voices are speaking up to defend the integrity of their state electoral systems. Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker has insisted that it is, quote, easy to vote but hard to cheat in his state. And the Secretary of State in Ohio, Jon Husted, told CNN that Trump's repeated claims are, quote, irresponsible, joining Democratic officials across the country who've been arguing the same for weeks. Today, during a White House press conference with the Prime Minister of Italy, President Obama offered his own opinion on the matter and made clear his disdain for Trump and his rhetoric on rigging.
If whenever things are going badly for you and you lose, you start blaming somebody else, then you don't have what it takes to be in this job. There is no serious person out there who would suggest somehow that you could even rig America's elections, in part because they're so decentralized and the numbers of votes involved. There's no evidence that that has happened in the past or that there are instances in which that will happen this time. And so I'd advise Mr. Trump to stop whining and go try to make his case to get votes. And if he got the most votes, then it would be my expectation of Hillary Clinton to offer a gracious concession speech and pledge to work with him in order to make sure that the American people benefit from an effective government. And it would be my job to welcome Mr. Trump, regardless of what he said about me or my differences with him on my opinions, and escort him over to the Capitol, in which there would be a peaceful transfer of power.
Mark, even Donald Trump's running mate, Mike Pence, has struggled to defend the Donald's attempts to delegitimize the outcome of this election. My question for you is whether we're reaching a point where Republicans en masse are going to feel compelled to stand up and say that Trump's rhetoric, his bogus claims about widespread electoral fraud, are just that, bogus.
Keep in mind, Republicans have been talking about election fraud now for several cycles. Donald Trump's not the first to do it. They're worried that he's going to say the election's illegitimate, and they're being responsible and stepping up and saying, if Trump loses, he loses. I don't think this will cause them to break with him en masse. I think this is part of the cumulative thing right now. If he is behind, and he's fallen behind in a way that is spooking some Republicans, they're worried it could hurt other candidates. They're worried that he could be blown out in a way that could remake the electoral map for the next presidential race. Then I think they'll look for excuses to break with him, and this could be one of them. But this on its own, I don't think, unless he keeps it up as his main message, I don't think this will be the breaking point.
Well, I'm going to give Republicans more credit here. It is the case. I'm not giving them credit for the thing I'm about to say. I'm giving them credit for the thing I'm going to say after that. The thing I'm going to not give them credit for is, yeah, they've talked about electoral fraud as a justification for voter ID laws. Right. But they talk about it in a general sense. Well, we have to be careful. There could be fraud, and right-thinking people cite the statistics and say it hasn't happened very much. But they haven't specifically come out and said what Trump has been saying in the last few days, which is it's happening on a widespread basis. There's voter fraud all over the place right now, in the past, and the present, and the future. And the thing I want to give them credit for, Scott Walker, the Secretary of State in Ohio, I think some of them just are like, hey, we run sound elections in my state. I'm responsible for the elections in my state. I'm not going to let Donald Trump trash my ability to run a legitimate, fair electoral process.
Here's what's troubling Republicans. This is part of the thing that Trump's saying now, which are the words of a desperate person who thinks he's going to lose.
Right.
Trashing the media, trashing other Republicans, blaming them, saying the system's rigged. All of these things would be fine if he were winning.
Well, but he wouldn't be saying them. He wouldn't be saying them if he were winning.
Well, no, you could still attack the press if you were winning.
Yes, but he wouldn't be saying all of them. It wouldn't be Trump against the world if he were 5 points up.
So what they're worried about is the more he sounds desperate, the more people are going to think he's not going to win.
Right.
The harder it's going to be to enthuse everybody they need to be.
Well, and look, a lot of Republicans have come to the same conclusion that a lot of analysts have come to, which is that Trump is almost certain to lose. And they, given that they've accepted that on some level, they don't want to get in a situation where Trump has burned the whole place down, because they are going to have to deal with President Hillary Clinton and potentially a Democratic Senate and maybe even a Democratic House. It's not helpful for them to have taken part in or tolerated Trump doing this thing that he's doing now.
All right, so while the president was hitting Donald Trump today, Hillary Clinton spent yet another news cycle off of the campaign trail as she prepares for tomorrow's debate here in Vegas. And yet, her campaign is making a lot of noise now about doing something new, expanding their attempts to win Republican-leaning states. One's most focused on Missouri, Indiana, and Arizona. Arizona is getting particular focus. Her campaign announced they're going to spend $2 million there. And they are sending in super surrogates, including Michelle Obama, Chelsea Clinton, and Bernie Sanders to the state. All three of those Republican-leaning states have got competitive Senate races. Democrats are hoping they can pick up those seats that are currently held by Republicans. So, John, is this relatively late attempt to expand the map smart?
Well, I want to say first that one of the things that we learned in 2008 and 2012 was that the Democratic candidate, in that case Barack Obama, had a better and more sophisticated polling operation internally than any media polls out there, right? I think the Clinton campaign has one that is more sophisticated, doing more calls on a daily basis than anybody in the press. This is a sign of great confidence, that they are looking at numbers that say, we are confident enough that we're going to be at 270, that it's now time to go spend some of our precious resources to try to help some of those down ballot candidates, and also to try to do what Democrats have dreamed of for a long time. Arizona was the one that Obama thought about reaching for in 12 and then decided not to do. Arizona is going to be first on the list for Hillary Clinton, and it's looking like that right now.
There are 4 reasons to do it. One is they've got the surrogates and the money to do it.
Right.
They don't need all the money they have, and they've got plenty of surrogates. 2 is they can help those down ballot races. 3 is it can help her get a more commanding win if she does win, with more of a mandate. And the last reason is psychological warfare. If they're playing offense while Donald Trump is trying to draw an inside straight, Trump has to worry that he ends up somehow winning Ohio, Florida, North Carolina, Iowa, and then losing Arizona or losing Utah.
Right.
So it's smart all around. I don't really see a downside to it.
Neither do I.
And as you said, they know what we know from talking to people who are polling on the ground.
Right.
Arizona is winnable.
Right. Arizona is winnable. These have been the states in Democratic reach state parlance. Arizona has been the one because of demographic change that people have thought in the right circumstances could tip first. Georgia, the most likely to tip second. Again, states like Missouri are not changing demographically as much. I think it's super smart, and it goes back to answering a question we asked for a long time. Why are they spending so much time raising money all throughout 2016? This is why, so they could get to this point and have money to burn if they needed to. All right. In an effort to deflect attention from the controversies plaguing him and to offer up a more conventional message to which he might be able to stick, Donald Trump rolled out a new 5-point ethics reform plan last night, framing himself as a Washington outsider who will cleanse the nation's center of power of its endemic corruption. His proposals include 5-year bans on lobbying for former executive branch officials and retired members of Congress. He wants to expand the definition of a lobbyist while banning former executive branch officials from lobbying for foreign governments. And Trump called for campaign finance changes that would prevent foreign lobbyists from raising money in U.S. elections. This afternoon, at a rally in Colorado Springs, Colorado, Trump added a 6th part to his shakeup list.
It is indeed time to drain the swamp in Washington, D.C. If I'm elected president, I will push for a constitutional amendment to impose term limits on all members of Congress. They've been talking about that for years. Decades of failure in Washington and decades of special interest dealing must and will come to an end.
Mark, as we suggested earlier, message discipline is kind of a foreign concept to Donald Trump, but if he has any, this is a message he's likely to keep driving at the debate here in Las Vegas tomorrow night. Do you think it is, first, good policy, and second, good politics?
I think it's pretty good policy. I tend to not like restrictions on the First Amendment, but I think that something has to be done to restore people's faith in the way Washington works, and one of the biggest suspicions they have is the way lobbying works. So I'm generally against stuff like this, but I could live with some of these provisions. I think term limits are silly.
Ridiculous.
But he's not going to have the message discipline to keep driving it.
Right.
His surrogates aren't going to bring it up because most of them don't believe in it. And it's too late. So it doesn't hurt. I think it's fine. Gives him something to talk about that's on message in terms of the Trump coalition. But 3 weeks to go, this kind of proposal, I don't think it'll make a big difference in the race.
What's the date today? October 18th? Is that right? October 18th, okay. I disagree with many of these policies on policy grounds for some of the reasons you do. First Amendment grounds, I think term limits are ridiculous in many ways and actually deleterious to having people in office who know what they're doing. But just as a matter of politics, it's October 18th. This is the kind of thing that a normal Republican nominee who wanted to run as a populist reformer would have rolled out in May and talked about for 6 months.
Maybe May of last year.
For 6 months at least he should have been talking about this. This could, again, even though I disagree with it on policy grounds, this could be politically powerful and salient if he'd been talking about it,
and he could
not starting on October 18th.
And he could pair it with the fact that there's lobbyists all over the Clinton campaign and the Clinton orbit. But
crazy that it took him this long to get.
All right, coming up, Senate Republican candidates are dancing and tiptoeing around Donald Trump, and also Melania Trump goes with the media. Both those stories when we come back. Not a lot of new presidential polling out today, but there was a new batch of Senate race polls out in Florida. Quinnipiac University has Senator Rubio, Republican, with a slight lead over his challenger, Democratic Congressman Patrick Murphy. Rubio's up within the margin of error, 49 to 47. In Pennsylvania, Republican Pat Toomey, the incumbent, is ahead of his Democratic challenger Katie McGinty, 49 to 45. Those two races have tightened up over the last couple of weeks, with Republicans still leading. In Ohio, Rob Portman, the Republican incumbent, who is the star of the cycle so far, has expanded his lead over the Democrat, the former Governor Ted Strickland. Portman now has a eye-popping 54 to 41% lead. All three of those Republican incumbents have a thing in common. Each has been in a debate against a Democratic challenger this week, and each has tried some way to distance himself from the party's presidential nominee.
There's no doubt that there is a lot of things I disagree with in the nominee of my party, And I've taken him on when he says things that are wrong on policy, and I've condemned him when he said things that are aggressive, outrageous, vulgar, and inappropriate, and I will continue to do so. The problem is the other party has nominated someone who has repeatedly violated federal law. I think it's pretty clear Donald Trump was not my first choice or even my 10th choice to be the nominee of the Republican Party. 14 million voters in the Republican primaries chose differently. But one of the reasons why I changed my mind and ran for re-election is because I know that no matter who wins this election, you are going to need people in the United States Senate willing to stand up to the next president of the United States when they are wrong on policy or when they are wrong in their behavior.
I made an extraordinary decision not to support my own party's nominee because I found his words that came out about a week or so ago to be so offensive and so wrong. I respect voters who take a different position on this. He did win the nomination of our party. I'm planning to support Mike Pence. Mike Pence was also elected by those delegates at the Republican convention. But again, this election isn't about Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. It's about Ted Strickland and Rob Portman.
I have not reached a point where I can endorse Donald Trump because I have so many concerns about his candidacy, the things that I have publicly mentioned. I do also acknowledge that, gosh, you know, he would sign some legislation that would be constructive. And so I feel like I'm in the same position as an awful lot of Pennsylvanians. We've got two badly flawed candidates. I can't believe in a country of 300 million, this is what we've got.
So, John, which parts of that rhetoric seems effective in creating the proper distance between the candidates and Trump?
Don't endorse Trump. Kick the crap out of him when necessary, and implicitly concede that he's likely to lose and that Hillary Clinton's likely to be in the White House, and make the implicit and sometimes explicit argument that you need to vote for me if you want to keep Republicans in control in the Senate as a balance against Democratic overreach.
Yeah. You know, people have talked about the fact that Trump can't wait for his comeback to Election Day because early voting has already started in places. The other reason he can't wait is because these Senate candidates are going to have to start producing their final TV ads. Right. They're in these debates over the next couple of weeks. He needs to have a comeback now. Otherwise, they are going to continue to distance. And you're going to see, I think, an unprecedented, in some states potentially, an unprecedented number of people who vote in the Senate race and leave the presidential race blank, the opposite of what you normally see.
Well, I think not just distance. I think you could see some very attacks from Republican Senate candidates if they're desperate enough. You look at what's happening. Rob Portman's clearly going to win re-election, barring some kind of weird thing that happens in the last days. But this Pat Toomey race and this Marco Rubio race, both of them, it's not clear to me that they're going to effectively outrun Trump or not. If the polls continue to widen at a national level, both those guys are going to be in serious jeopardy. And I can imagine them resorting to some very desperate measures, anti-Trump measures, in the closing days if they think that's what's necessary to save their own.
As weird as this cycle has been, there is a rule that I've long believed in because the data supports it. If you're an incumbent senator, you raise money, you fight for your seat, you stay in touch with your constituents. Unless you're running against a superstar candidate, you probably keep your seat, even in a weird year. And these Republican incumbents are all doing well, even in states where Trump is not doing nearly as well.
All right. Everyone is talking about those two silence-breaking interviews with Melania Trump that aired last night and today, one with CNN and the other with Fox News. Both of those interviews have given us a fuller picture of Melania's public response to the Access Hollywood video of Donald Trump boasting about sexual assault and the flood of accusations from women that followed. Melania Trump was well prepared and stuck to the script more than her husband typically does. But in certain respects, if you listen closely, her words were just as provocative as the Donalds often are.
It was left-wing and left-wing media. And you could see that, and the way it comes out was everything was organized because they want to influence the American people how to vote with the details that they go. Did they ever check the background of these women? They don't have any facts. They were kind of a boy talk, and he was lead on, like egg on, from the host to say dirty and bad stuff.
You feel the host, Billy Bush, was sort of egging him on?
Yes. It's kind of two teenage boys. Actually, they should behave better, right?
He was 59.
Correct. And sometimes I said, I have two boys at home. I have my young son and I have my husband.
So, Mark, there's been some scattered criticism of Melania Trump for some of the things she said, but not nearly as much as you might expect, given the kind of loaded nature of some of those claims. Why do you think that is?
I don't really know. I mean, I think spouses in general get something of a pass. She basically said there's a vast left-wing conspiracy against her husband. She asserted without any proof that this has been orchestrated by the Democrats. Right. I know they're asserting that. Some of the accusers have given money to Hillary Clinton, support Hillary Clinton, but there's no even assertion of evidence, let alone evidence. So I think if she wants to come out and defend her husband, I'm all for it. She's the right to do it. But people should be scrutinizing what she said and trying to get the campaign to explain what is she talking about.
I think there's some amount of implicit sympathy people have for her.
Sure.
You know, I mean, again, she made her own bed. She married Donald Trump, but now
she also said, "I'm tough. I can handle it." If she's going to come out,
but I know, I understand. I'm just saying, like, I think anthropologically, some people are kind of like, look, this woman's been through this. This is a horrible thing that's happening. Her husband's wronged her in various ways. Let's give her a pass. You know, and I also think that there is some sense, slightly patronizing sense, that like people don't think she maybe fully understands the American electoral system that well. I mean, I think the fact that she's foreign-born and the way she speaks allows some people to kind of patronizingly.
Well, there's one more element, which is the Clintons don't want to drive this because they don't want.
Right. Yes.
They don't want to raise these issues. All right, coming up, we're going to preview tomorrow's debate here in Las Vegas. Right after this.
We're back here on the campus of the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, on the eve of the third and final presidential debate. That arena behind me is, as they say, the room where it happens. Joining us now is MSNBC political correspondent Kasie Hunt. Kasie, we've been talking about the fact that the Clinton campaign is now moving into what they call the reach states or the expansion states. Georgia, Texas, Arizona, Missouri, Indiana, all talked about. Right. Some things are happening in all of them. Which are the ones where they are really going to play?
I think Arizona is the one to watch because, A, they think it is actually potentially winnable. I think, yes, it's about the media, but it's not a head feint like some of the others. It's also something that they can potentially win with a relatively small investment. They don't necessarily have to like bet the farm on Arizona to potentially make a difference. Georgia, I think, is a little further out, maybe the next one on their list. I think Texas is a real stretch. I think if we're talking about Texas, that's, you know, we're probably buying in a little bit too much to their spin.
I forgot about Utah. That's just
Utah. Well, that's just kind of an odd one, right? So with the third-party candidate, I think they're hopeful. They've kind of got their fingers crossed in Utah, but I don't think it feels kind of in a fundamental way the same as Arizona.
Right.
Let's talk about WikiLeaks, daily disclosures. There's still nothing in them that's massive that changes the race, but how are they sort of accommodating to the culture of a daily disclosure? Do they read them all? Are they ready to respond? How do they deal with it?
So my sense is that they are ready for the next round of disclosures, in so much as I think that they are probably less surprised by what we all are learning every day as these come out than we maybe thought that they were. Clearly, John Podesta could give anyone access to his personal emails. So I do think that they are prepared to deal with kind of what comes out. I do think that we are operating in a remarkable new normal that I think, their challenge is covering this is very difficult for a lot of people in the press. And I think that that's a hurdle for them, because trying to figure out how to explain it, put it in context when, it's very easy to read a clicky headline off of a lot of these, it's just new and different territory.
One sense is that there's a certain kind of thing going on with them about this, which is not that they think they're going to be bombshells that are going to matter politically, but just the culture of the campaign. The people are worried about there being disclosures about people trashing each other, and kind of instead of looking towards victory with great enthusiasm, it's like, oh God, this could be a really bad couple weeks if we find out our bosses think we stink.
Yeah, it's incredibly awkward to have all of this out there, and I think that there are a lot of things people are willing to say in private that they won't say in public, and to have that all on display, it also, I think, probably undermines the ability of her staff to do their jobs effectively. Right. If you think about, how any of us respond if accidentally you email the wrong person and then you've spent an hour apologizing and worrying, I think, don't underestimate how that can potentially impact a campaign, especially in a stretch as intense and final as this one.
Have you done that a lot?
Third and final debate. I know you've been with the campaign enough to get a sense of their ups and downs. They seem pretty confident right now, not just about the debate, but about the outcome, right?
I think that they are pretty confident right now, yes. And I think they've been careful to approach her prep for this third debate the same way they did the others. I think this time they're probably a little bit more ready to take a curveball. I mean, they were surprised by that press conference Donald Trump put together at the last second. I think they were very focused on making sure that Hillary Clinton herself was not rattled by that and did not appear to be rattled. I think they'll be more ready for that if something like it happens at this event. So I think from that perspective, they're going forward. And I do think, look, we wouldn't be talking about Arizona and these other battleground states if there wasn't a certain durability to her lead that they felt pretty strongly.
Trump has criticized her for taking too many days off the trail. After this debate, is she just full scheduled all the way through to Election Day?
It's looking like that so far, yes. It's still, some of the details are still coming together, but my sense is that the pace is going to pick up pretty aggressively. I mean, look, I think, they're not, I don't think they're making it up when they say she's taking this time off to focus on the preparation. I think, if anything, we've saw with the pneumonia issue, they've had trouble getting her off the trail.
All right. Kasie Hunt, always awesome. Thank you for coming. We'll be right back with more from here in my favorite city in America, Las Vegas. Right after this quick break.
Of course it is.
It is.
Joined now by our coast-to-coast strategist on the left coast in San Diego, Mindy Tucker Fletcher. She worked for George W. Bush, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and others. And on the right coast, D.C. Bureau Democratic strategist and co-founder of Purple Strategy, Steve McMahon. Thank you both for joining us. Let's start basic. Mindy, you are a Republican. You're not for Donald Trump, but give us your sense of the state of the race. What are Donald Trump's chances of winning this?
Well, first of all, I always remind people there are several weeks left in the election. Anything can happen. There's a debate left. That can change things always. But it's not looking good. He has, of his own volition, I don't care how many years ago it was, said something that has really shaken the race up and I think turned off a large group of voters who will not be voting for him now. I think he's in trouble.
Steve McMahon, tick off the things that would have to happen to put Donald Trump in position to win the race.
Well, first of all, the international conspiracy that's being waged would have to stop. The media would have to stop doing everything it can to block his path to the White House.
Give me a serious list. Serious list.
Well, listen. What he needs to do is he needs to give people some reason to be for him. He needs to stop attacking Paul Ryan. He needs to stop, frankly, attacking Hillary Clinton, and he needs to get back to a change argument that, frankly, is really, really powerful. And if he had stuck to it from the beginning or from his convention and not gotten off on all these rabbit holes, he might be in a different position today. But I think Mindy's right. I think what he said 11 years ago ultimately shook this race to its core. There were people who hadn't decided, who were still considering him. And I believe that those people largely are now turning against him. And I think what you're going to see is the erosion will continue. It's going to get worse. There are going to be more and more Republican senators who are in jeopardy. I think the Democratic chances in the House have improved dramatically. I think it's still tough, but now it's possible, and it's all because of Donald Trump.
Steve, I'm going to stay with you. We all assume there are going to be more hacked emails that come out between now and Election Day, that WikiLeaks will continue to be a factor. Most of the stuff is not broken through with voters, especially compared to the controversies around Trump. What would it take in terms of a WikiLeaks revelation? What kind of revelation would it take to finally actually cut ice and have real political impact on the race?
Well, first of all, I think it would take a revelation. It would have to be something that goes beyond kind of the normal sort of gossipy stuff that you see inside campaigns. I mean, what's come out of WikiLeaks so far is interesting. And for those of us on the inside, you know, we read it, we think, well, I know that person, I know this person. But to a voter, it doesn't make any difference. It's not anything interesting. It's not anything newsworthy. In order for something revelatory to occur, it would have to be something that, you know, that stops the news cycle in its tracks, like Donald Trump's tape did, and that gets people to ask again about Hillary Clinton, is this what we really want to do? They were asking that question at one time. I think she's answered it pretty effectively. I think her campaign has done a really good job of mitigating and minimizing the impact of all this noise. And it's really all Donald Trump just stepping all over himself for the last 2 weeks.
Mindy, we talked earlier on the show about Melania Trump coming out and doing these two interviews that aired last night and today. To me, looking at that, that suggests that the Trump campaign recognizes that it still has a problem as a result of the fault that both the Access Hollywood tape and the women who have come forward and continue to come forward to accuse Donald Trump. Does it look like that to you? This is a situation where you send the spouse out because you recognize you're still hemorrhaging voters, hemorrhaging support?
Yeah, that's exactly what it looked like to me. Is they thought it was going to go away. They tried to blame Bill Clinton. They trotted out all of his women problems. It's not going away. It's way bigger than I think they anticipated it, which again just shows us how, you know, disjointed he is from reality, that he can say these things and it won't be a big deal. But I think definitely bringing her out, and I don't know that it's going to help at this point. It's not big enough to overcome what he said, and it's, you know, we're still talking about this a week later. It's a problem for him. It's not going away. I don't have any great advice for him, nor would I give it to him if I did, to change this around.
Mindy, does it matter if Hillary Clinton starts talking more about her agenda for the country, about bringing the country together? Did that make a difference in either her chances of winning over the last few weeks or her chances of governing if she does win?
I think it's helpful. You know, what Michelle Obama showed us last week is that her surrogates can be really powerful. The anger against her and the problems she has haven't changed. They're still there. There are still a lot of people in America angry with her and don't trust her. That still exists. But as others are able to come out with a bigger message about America and the soul of our country and how much this election matters bigger than party, I think that goes a long way to helping Hillary Clinton. Michelle Obama knocked it out of the park last week. She really changed the face of this election for a lot of people, especially women. And if they can continue to make moves like that, I think that would be really helpful to her and very smart.
So if I could, I think Mindy's right about what...
Go ahead, Steve.
I was going to say, I think Mindy's right about what Michelle Obama was able to accomplish, but I also think, Mark, that you were right when you start to talk about this turn that Hillary Clinton can begin to make toward uniting the country, toward a hopeful future that's a better future for everybody, a willingness to work with Republicans when it's appropriate and to fight them when necessary, because she is, after all, going to be elected president with a pretty substantial electoral college majority. But I don't see any harm in reaching out her hand and saying, I understand that it's my job to make this country work. I know the Republicans control the Congress for the moment, and I'm going to work with whoever's there to move this country forward. I think a lot of people would like to hear that, and especially those people who for a week, until a week ago, were on the fence. They would like some reassurance.
Steve, Chris Wass, a pretty aggressive questioner. If you were Hillary Clinton's team, what topic would you be most worried about his raising tomorrow night in the debate?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't want to be talking about, you know, any sort of allegations about the Clinton Foundation, the quid pro quos and those things, because you can't really disprove a negative. And any time you're spent talking on that, you're off your message. I presume Chris Wallace will ask about that stuff. I think Donald Trump will press it. I think Hillary Clinton would be wise to sort of step past it and look to the future. She's going to be the next president of the United States. She's going to be the first woman. She's going to come to office at a time that's very partisan, very polarized. Her approval numbers are not going to probably be too much better than they are right now. And it's her job to try to bring this country together. And she can start that tomorrow night by looking like a grown-up and by looking past these childish questions.
Mindy, at this moment, do you anticipate Democrats controlling the Senate and or the House come November 9th?
I'm sort of on the fence about it. I think there's a chance, just given what's going on, and if Hillary continues to snowball her lead and she's going into places like Arizona and who knows a week from now what other states we're going to be talking about. But I also am very aware of this anger that still exists out there and this frustration. And so I'm hopeful that in some way that manifests itself in sort of a bipartisan result where we have checks and balances in terms of party in Washington. But I'm not going to predict. I think if you'd asked me a year ago, I would have said Donald Trump would never be our nominee, and here we are. So I've given up predicting in this election. It's too crazy. I just think we all need to be mindful of the sentiment out there and what's going on and how angry people are and the fact that we could end up with just about anything in November.
Okay, Mindy Tucker Fletcher, not angry. Steve McMahon, not angry, but seeing the anger all around us. Thank you both. We're going to check in with some reporters who cover the presidential race when we come back right after this.
Welcome back to Sin City. We are here at the site of the third and final presidential debate, which will be held on this campus in Las Vegas tomorrow night. And we're joined now by two Bloomberg Politics reporters, Kevin Cirilli and Sahil Kapoor. Gentlemen, good to see you both. Kevin, just give us a window into the state of mind in Donald Trump's world as he arrives here in the city that has a big building with his name on it.
John, I spoke with a senior Trump advisor just before I came on the show, and what he told me is that we're going to see Donald Trump continuing to use the same strategy that he used at the second debate. He's going to use that same attack, the same line of attack, very aggressive against Hillary Clinton, being advised now, of course, by RNC Chairman Reince Priebus, as well as Governor Chris Christie.
Will there be a pre-debate press conference with women alleging wrongdoing by Bill Clinton, or just different women? Like, what's going to happen this time?
Well, you know, we didn't know. We walked into that blindsided last time, so anything could happen, of course, in the Trump campaign.
Rigging.
Right.
What do you think about this argument that Trump is making as a matter just of pure politics? Does it make any sense for him to be making this argument?
It makes sense to mobilize his base. His base loves this stuff. He's been making this argument pretty consistently since he lost Iowa to Ted Cruz. He said that was, there's something fishy going on there. When there was talk about a contested convention and stopping him there, he made the argument that, there's something fishy. Party bosses were rigging the election. After the convention, when he was slipping with the Khan fiasco, he made the same argument. Right. It's popular with his base. They really like it, and it's showing up in the polls. 41% of the electorate thinks there's a good chance, there's a decent chance that the election could be stolen from him, including 73% of Republican voters. As a matter of politics, for the people he needs to win, I don't think it's going to work.
Let's talk about WikiLeaks. How much is the Trump campaign, the RNC, relying on some gift from WikiLeaks to change the race?
I think that's really where they're at right now. And then in all of the sources that I've interviewed within the Trump campaign, they're realistic about a narrowing path to victory, but they are still adamant that things like a rigged election are playing well to the base, things like term limits in Congress, and of course WikiLeaks. And they have doubled down, and we reported on this yesterday on Bloomberg, that the media, in their minds, has not placed enough emphasis on this. But I think from a turnout perspective, if you look at that is what they feel could still give them a boost on Election Day. But David Sedaris had a good column on this in the New Yorker earlier about how a lot of people are not motivated to get to the polls who are independents, and they feel that could help them on Election Day as well.
Do you think it's a fair critique of the press that we have not covered the WikiLeaks revelations enough?
Well, I think the WikiLeaks revelations came out, I think, within an hour or so of the Trump tape coming out. So sure, that's drowned out, some of the WikiLeaks coverage. I do think there would have been a lot more WikiLeaks coverage if not for that, and that has a certain cachet with people. I think it's a sexier story, so I think a lot of press has been focusing on that.
Of all the things that have come out through the WikiLeaks disclosure since last Friday, are there any that you think either should or will break through with voters?
I think some of the things she said in the transcripts of her speeches to Goldman Sachs will be a problem. I think some of that stuff would have been really explosive in the hands of Bernie Sanders around January or so. The Trump campaign is hammering the part where she talks about a public and private position. They're painting her as very cozy with big banks, and they have been, and I think this will feed that narrative. It's standard for a lot of politicians to have that public and private view. You negotiate one way, and you argue a certain thing another way. So I think it'll matter to a point, but they've got to get this stuff out of the headlines. They've got to get beyond the women. He can't keep talking about conspiracies and that sort of thing, because I don't think it wins him anybody he doesn't already have.
I'm going to start with you and then go to you on this question. So this news that the Clinton campaign is now expanding the map, trying to expand the map, primarily in Arizona, where they're setting Michelle Obama. We're talking about maybe Hillary Clinton even going there. There are a bunch of other states where they're doing various things, either small things or head feints. Right. What do you make of that strategy, about the wisdom of it and about the potential efficacy of it?
I think it's partly psyops. They're trying to make the Trump campaign scared. They're trying to portray a certain air of confidence that they have these swing states locked up. I think, when you look at the polling averages, it is looking pretty bad for Trump right now. I looked at the polling averages before coming on the show, and right now Hillary Clinton has a better shot at winning Texas and at winning Arizona than Trump has of winning Colorado, Virginia, or Pennsylvania. So I think, there is an element of, we're so far ahead and we're sending, one of our best surrogates there. I don't think that necessarily means she's going to win, but she's trying to psych him out.
When the Trump campaign sees that, they are psyched out, or they are, who cares? What's their view?
I think like anything in the Trump campaign, they love fighting and they love to bulldoze their way through this. I spoke with one campaign aide who told me that any other candidate in the past 10 days would be out of this race or even trailing even more significantly than he is right now. He likes to fight. I think you're going to see that tomorrow night. But again, I think let's be realistic here. He's down in the polls.
Well, when they see Hillary Clinton go to Arizona, do they think, boy, we better get back to Arizona again? Or do they think, that's nothing, she has no chance of winning there? I mean, specifically on those states, yeah.
I think on Arizona, they feel that they've mobilized the grassroots community as a result of things like immigration. And I think, candidly, what we're seeing in Arizona is that the other side has also mobilized on the issue of immigration. But Arizona, point blank, is all about immigration and Sheriff Joe Arpaio's diminished role within the Republican Party in that state in particular.
On both ends.
On both
Democrats
ends,
on immigration and for
made a new policy proposal yesterday on ethics and lobbying, today on term limits. Are they going to continue to unveil new policy, do we know?
Yes, and I think that specifically with regards to the rigged election, which again, let's be frank here, Elizabeth Warren had advocated for years that Wall Street has been rigged. So this isn't a new populist tone. It is new with regards to elections, but they are now pivoting, using that to talk specifically about term limits, which is very popular in a bipartisan way.
Yeah. Okay, so that's Kevin Cirilli in the green tie. That's how you know it's Cirilli. And Sahil Kapoor in the blue and black tie. That's how you know it's Sahil. That's the only way to tell them apart. Thank you for both coming on the show. You're both fantastic. We will head out to Colorado for some reporting on Donald Trump's day on the trail next. And if you're watching us in Washington, D.C., you can now listen to us as well on the radio at Bloomberg 99.1 FM. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to Vegas. With us now from Grand Junction, Colorado. Donald Trump is currently holding a rally. One ear on Trump, one ear on us. NBC News Trump correspondent Katie Tur. Katie, I'll talk loud, you'll listen quiet and talk quiet. Is Donald, what is Trump campaign thinks going right these days?
Question. They do think their rallies are going right. They like that. They're still getting pretty large crowds at various places around the country. Their fundraising is going well. Their small donors are still coming in pretty hot on their website. They're getting a lot of money. But certainly the headlines are not going well for Donald Trump. He's facing these sexual assault allegations. He's still talking about this 2005 audio leak. They've got this this whole rigged election thing that they've been speaking about, they are obviously trying to hit that very hard. But the headlines that are coming out of it is Donald Trump basically is trying to say that if he doesn't win, this has got to be a rigged election. And now we have President Obama telling him to quit whining. So the good news for the campaign isn't quite as dominating as, say, the bad news is at the moment.
Katie, Donald Trump, as you just pointed out, has been making this rigged election argument, right? People around him, from Kellyanne Conway to Mike Pence, have tried to basically say, well, what he means by rigged is that the media is against him. They're rigging the election. He's not talking about electoral fraud. And then Trump comes out and tweets or says, no, I'm talking about electoral fraud. So does he, why is there so much disjuncture between what everyone else in the Trump campaign is saying, trying to stay on the right side of this issue, and Trump's continued desire to go off into a much more radical critique?
That is a good question, and we've seen that this entire campaign season, where Donald Trump would say one thing, and then his surrogates or his campaign would try and clean it up by saying, oh, no, 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 what he really meant was this. In this case, it's particularly glaring because we've seen a number of surrogates go out and say that Donald Trump is just talking about the media, but then on the same day as they're saying that, Donald Trump will come out and he will tweet something like, the polling is rigged. And he says this on the campaign trail quite a bit as well, talking about in Pennsylvania that we need to watch communities in Philadelphia that are known to cheat. He's also talking about how dead people are still in the voting rolls and they are still voting. It's a message that is resonating with his base guys. We hear it from pretty much everyone we speak with, that they believe that if Trump doesn't win, that means that in some way the books were cooked against him. But in terms of the disconnect between he and the campaign, I think it just goes to show you that Donald Trump is the ultimate voice for his campaign, and nobody can tell him what to do. If he's got an idea in his head, he's going to say it, which is why we always saw Corey Lewandowski earlier on say, let Trump be Trump. I'm not going to speak for Mr. Trump, because ultimately he's going to go out and contradict everybody anyway.
Katie, second event of the day in Colorado, a state where most polling suggests Trump is way behind. They're still looking, though, for the right inside straight combination to get to 270 electoral votes. Just talk a little bit about the event you're at there now, the staging of it, and the sense of it as compared to an event in Florida, Ohio, or some of the other states where he spent more time.
Well, I can tell you that Donald Trump got on stage and the first thing he said was make sure to mail in your votes, which is what you do in Colorado. You mail in your votes. They are trying to get on the ground here with the RNC, team up and go door to door, but Colorado is a tough state, and Donald Trump hasn't had a great operation here from the start. Remember during the primaries that he basically didn't show up to the convention. His team didn't show up to the convention here and all but handed it over to Ted Cruz. Donald Trump talked about the GOP convention here basically being rigged against him back then. This is the home of the Never Trump movement. So Colorado hasn't been easy from the start. He does have vocal supporters here, and you can hear them behind me. But for the most part, the support in this state is not as large as we see in other states. States that they were hoping, this certainly is a state that they were hoping to turn red after a few seasons of being in the Democratic category. But I will say that it's interesting that he's spending so much time in Colorado, given that he's down 8 points in the latest Quinnipiac poll, especially since a state like Arizona, which he's hoping to keep red, is one that is could be slipping away from him. Hillary Clinton is running a very close race down there. We're seeing Chelsea Clinton there, Michelle Obama there, Bernie Sanders going there next week. Donald Trump, it's unclear whether when he's going to be going back to Arizona, but that is a state that he's clearly going to need to focus a little bit more on if he wants to maintain that.
Katie, less than 30 seconds to go. Any insight into how Trump is approaching the debate here tomorrow?
They're not telling us exactly what he is doing for debate prep, but I can tell you that there will be the mother of somebody who died in Benghazi, and we believe she's going to be sitting in the front row, invited by Donald Trump, the same mother, Pat Smith, that spoke at the convention. They clearly want to put Hillary Clinton in an uncomfortable position like they did in the last debate and try and get some sort of confrontation out of it.
Okay, Katie Tur in Colorado. We'll see you here tomorrow. Thank you very much. John and I will be right back in Vegas after this.
So tomorrow night there's a debate, and there's also Britney Spears coming back to Vegas to play.
As we say in Vegas, pick 'em.
Which more exciting for you?
Pick 'em.
I'm looking forward to Britney more than the debate. That's the truth. Head to BloombergPolitics.com right now for more of our election coverage. We'll be back tomorrow from Las Vegas for the third and final debate. That includes our live pre- and post-game coverage on Twitter. Sayonara.
I'm Nina Melendez, and you're watching Bloomberg Technology. Let's start with your first word news. Russian and Syrian warplanes are halting airstrikes on the besieged city of Aleppo. The suspension is intended to give civilians and militants safe passage out of the city. Russia says forces will observe the pause between 8 a.m. and 4 p.m. Thursday. German Chancellor Angela Merkel will host a Ukraine peace summit in Berlin tomorrow. It's her first meeting in more than a year with Russian, Ukrainian, and French presidents, but she's downplaying expectations for any significant progress. And for the first time ever, Donald Trump is on pace to outspend Hillary Clinton on TV ads this week. Trump is expected to spend $14 million on television ads compared to $10 million for Clinton. That's based on data from Kantar Media, which tracks political advertising. And Vogue magazine is endorsing Hillary Clinton for president. It's the first time the fashion publication has officially backed a presidential candidate. The editors say, quote, "We understand that Clinton has not always been a perfect candidate, yet her fierce intelligence and considerable experience are reflected in policies and positions that are clear, sound, and hopeful," end quote. Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,600 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Nina Melendez. This is Bloomberg. Bloomberg Technology is next.
Chang, and this is Bloomberg Technology. Coming up, Intel sinks in after-hours trading despite beating estimates. We'll break down the chip maker's fourth quarter warning. Plus, Zenefits looks beyond its checkered past with a new product launch. Our exclusive conversation with newly minted CEO David Sachs ahead. And could owning a car become merely a hobby in the years ahead? We'll catch up with Lyft co-founder John Zimmer on the future of driving and his continuing battle with Uber. First to our lead. Intel shares are slipping in after-hours trading while the company beat on earnings and revenue. It reported fourth quarter sales may miss estimates. The dimmer outlook may indicate slower PC demand and that manufacturers will again be sitting on a stockpile of chips. Bloomberg editor-at-large Corey Johnson spoke with Intel's executive vice president leading manufacturing, operations, and sales, Stacy Smith, right after earnings were released and asked him about the outlook ahead. Take a listen.
We had an outstanding third quarter, and our view of the second half is up significantly from where we were 90 days ago. And that strength it's a combination of we're seeing some strength in the PC business, but as you see in our Q3 results, we had record revenue in the data center and record revenue in the Internet of Things group, which is kind of our strategy playing out here. Specific to the PC segment, we're up from when we originally set the guidance for Q3. We're up by almost $1 billion in revenue, and the PC segment is the largest piece of that. What we're seeing in that market is we're seeing some in-market strength, particularly in the business PCs, and we're seeing our customers starting to put a little bit more inventory in place as they anticipate the sales in the fourth quarter. And then moving to the fourth quarter, what we're expecting kind of a normal PC market, but we think some of that inventory gets consumed, and so we have a little bit of a below seasonal Q4 against the backdrop of a very strong second half and much stronger than what we thought.
Why are PC makers in this day and age doing such an inventory build that will remind us of years past when they would sort of overorder and try to manage their stuff by getting it in early?
So I don't think I wouldn't characterize it as as excess inventory in any shape or form. I think what we've seen is that the PC manufacturers are managing inventory very, very lean, and as they saw in demand strengthening, they just put a little bit more inventory in place to